They laughed when my sister slid a crumpled $20 bill across the table and said, "Here, Emily, since you're struggling again," and no one, not my husband, not my father-in-law, said a word to stop her. Someone even chuckled as if it were a harmless joke, as if I hadn't just spent 22 years serving a country that demanded everything and explained nothing. My mother-in-law leaned back in her chair, sipping wine, and added, "It's hard when you don't have a real career," while the chandelier light reflected off crystal glasses and polished silverware, turning the entire moment into something staged, something rehearsed, something I had apparently been cast in without consent. I remember the exact sound of the fork against porcelain when it paused mid-air, not because anyone was shocked, but because they were waiting for me to react, to defend myself, to confirm exactly what they already believed I was. I didn't give them that. I just sat there, hands steady, breathing slow, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them think they had won. And if this story speaks to you, only if it truly resonates with you. Take a moment to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from, your city, your country, and the local time where you are right now, because I want to know how far this story travels and who it reaches. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 43 years old, and this was the night my husband's family finally realized they had been humiliating the wrong woman all along. It didn't start with the $20 bill. It started years earlier, long before that dining room, long before the laughter, back when I first learned that in some families, silence isn't peace, it's permission. When I married Daniel, I knew his family was different from mine, but I didn't realize how carefully they measured worth, how quietly they categorized people, how everything from your job title to your bank account determined how much space you were allowed to take up in a room. At first, the comments were subtle, almost polite, the kind you could dismiss if you wanted to keep the peace, like when my sister-in-law Lauren would ask, "So, are you still traveling a lot for that job?" with just enough hesitation to suggest it wasn't really a career, or when my father-in-law would nod slowly and say, "That must be interesting work," the way people talk about hobbies, not professions. I let it pass because I had learned early that correcting people who had already decided who you were rarely changed anything. It only made them defensive, louder, more certain. And besides, I wasn't there to prove anything to them. I had nothing to gain from their approval. But over time, the tone shifted, the questions turned into statements, the politeness thinned out, and the assumptions hardened into something sharper, something harder to ignore. Dinners became performances, each one following the same script. Daniel's promotion celebrated in detail, Lauren's investments praised like milestones, and then, eventually, someone would turn to me, always with that same rehearsed curiosity, and ask a question that wasn't really a question at all. "So what exactly do you do again? Or do you ever think about settling down into something more stable?" Or my personal favorite, "It must be nice not having so much responsibility," delivered with a smile that didn't reach the eyes. And every time, I gave them just enough to keep the conversation moving without giving them anything real. Because I had learned something far more valuable than arguing. I had learned how to wait. They thought my silence meant weakness, that it confirmed their version of me, the one they had built out of incomplete information and comfortable assumptions. They had no idea that silence, in my world, wasn't surrender, it was discipline. And that night, sitting at that long polished table, listening to them reduce my life to a joke wrapped in $20 and a glass of wine, I realized something had shifted, not in them, but in me. Because for the first time, I wasn't just letting them talk, I was letting them finish. They had no idea that in just a few minutes, everything they thought they understood about me was about to collapse under the weight of a single sentence, spoken by someone they would never dare to laugh at. The air did not shift right away, not after the laughter, not after the comment, not even after I set the $20 bill neatly beside my plate as if it belonged there. Dinner continued, or at least they tried to make it look that way. Forks moving again, glasses clinking softly, conversations resuming in uneven fragments like a machine restarting after a brief interruption. Daniel leaned slightly toward me, his voice low enough to sound private but not enough to be supportive. "You could have just taken it, you know. No need to make it awkward." And I turned my head just enough to meet his eyes, not with anger, not with hurt, but with something far quieter, something he did not recognize. because for years he had only known the version of me that chose peace over correction. Across the table, Lauren was already moving on, laughing about a recent trip, describing a resort in Scottsdale with the kind of detail that made it clear she expected admiration, and everyone gave it to her, nodding, asking questions, reinforcing the hierarchy that had been carefully built over years of dinners just like this. I sat back slightly, my posture relaxed, my hands resting calmly in my lap, and for the first time, I noticed how predictable it all was, how scripted every interaction felt, how each person played their role without deviation. My mother-in-law refilled her wine glass and glanced at me briefly, not to check on me, but to confirm that I had stayed in my place, that I had not disrupted the balance. I gave her nothing, no expression, no reaction, just the same composed stillness I had carried through rooms far less forgiving than this one. Outside, I could hear the faint hum of a car pulling into the driveway, tires crunching lightly against gravel, a sound so ordinary that no one else at the table paid it any attention, but I did. Not because I was expecting someone, not because I was waiting for anything, but because I had learned to notice details that others ignored, small shifts that signaled larger changes. Daniel continued speaking, explaining something about quarterly projections, his voice confident, practiced, completely unaware that the narrative he believed in was already beginning to fracture. I let my gaze drift toward the front hallway, just for a second, then back to the table, timing everything in my head with the same quiet precision that had become second nature to me. Lauren raised her glass again. "To success," she said, smiling in my direction with a sweetness that did not quite reach her eyes, and a few others echoed the toast, their voices overlapping, their confidence intact. I lifted my glass as well, not in agreement, not in defiance, but simply because it was expected, because blending in had always been part of the strategy. The front door opened, the sound subtle but distinct, followed by measured footsteps that did not rush, did not hesitate, each one deliberate, controlled, unfamiliar in this house where movement was usually casual, unguarded. No one turned at first, not until the footsteps reached the edge of the dining room, and even then, it was only a partial glance, the kind people give to an interruption they assume will be insignificant. I did not turn immediately either. I let the moment stretch, just one breath longer than necessary, before I shifted my eyes toward the doorway. A man stood there in uniform, posture straight, presence unmistakable, his gaze scanning the room once before, settling, not on Daniel, not on my father-in-law, but on me. There was a pause, small but undeniable, the kind that does not announce itself but changes everything. Lauren's voice faltered mid-sentence, just slightly, as if she sensed something without understanding it. Daniel followed the man's line of sight, confusion flickering across his face as he tried to place the situation into a context that made sense to him. I remained still, my expression unchanged, my breathing steady, because this was the moment I had been waiting for, not with anticipation, not with anxiety, but with certainty. The man took a step forward, then another, the sound of his boots against the hardwood floor cutting cleanly through the room's fragile normalcy, and as he came to a stop beside the table, just within reach of the light, I could see it clearly now, the recognition in his eyes, sharp and immediate, the kind that does not need confirmation. He did not speak right away, and that silence, that deliberate pause, stretched across the table like a held breath, pulling every conversation, every assumption, every quiet judgment into a single suspended moment that had not yet broken, but was about to. No one spoke, not at first, not when the man stopped at the edge of the table, not when his eyes locked onto mine with a clarity that cut through every assumption in the room, because recognition like that does not ask permission. It simply arrives. I could feel the shift before anyone else could name it. The subtle tightening of posture, the hesitation in breath, the quiet instinct people have when they sense authority but cannot yet define it. Daniel straightened slightly in his chair, his expression shifting from mild irritation to something closer to uncertainty, while my father-in-law set his glass down a little too carefully, as if precision could restore control. Lauren blinked, her smile faltering just enough to reveal confusion beneath it, her earlier confidence slipping in small, almost imperceptible cracks. The man took one final step forward, stopping beside my chair, and for a moment he said nothing. his presence alone enough to redraw the entire room. Then, with a composure that mirrored my own, he brought his hand up in a clean, practiced motion, not rushed, not exaggerated, but exact, and every movement carried weight. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady, clear, unmistakably formal, "welcome back, Major General." And just like that, the room fractured. The words did not echo, they did not need to. They landed with a finality that left no space for reinterpretation, no room for polite dismissal, no convenient way to pretend they had not been said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with realization, with recalculation, with the sudden collapse of every quiet judgment that had been built over years. Lauren's hand froze midair, her wine glass suspended inches above the table as if gravity itself had paused to witness the moment. Daniel's face lost color, not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention, but in that subtle, undeniable way that happens when certainty is replaced with something else entirely. My mother-in-law blinked once, twice, her expression struggling to reconcile the woman she thought she knew with the title that had just been spoken. My father-in-law opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again, as if language itself had become temporarily unavailable. I did not rush to fill the silence. I did not explain, did not clarify, did not soften what had just been revealed, because none of that was necessary. Instead, I turned my head slightly toward the man beside me and gave a small, controlled nod, the kind that acknowledged both recognition and protocol without inviting further attention. "Thank you, Captain," I said quietly, my voice even, measured, the same voice I had used in rooms far more consequential than this one. And that was when it settled, not just the words, but the meaning behind them, the weight of what they had dismissed, the magnitude of what they had misunderstood. Daniel shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence replaced by something uncertain, searching, as if he were trying to locate the version of me he thought he understood and could not find it anymore. Lauren slowly lowered her glass, her eyes fixed on me now, not with mockery, not with casual dismissal, but with something closer to disbelief, the kind that comes when reality refuses to match expectation. No one laughed this time, no one spoke over the moment, no one tried to redirect the conversation, because there was nowhere else for it to go. The hierarchy they had relied on, the quiet system of value they had enforced without ever naming it, had just been rewritten in a single sentence delivered by someone they instinctively respected. And I remained exactly as I had been all evening, composed, still, unchanged, because the truth did not alter who I was, it only revealed it. I reached for my glass, took a small sip of water, and set it back down with the same calm precision, letting the silence continue just long enough for them to fully understand that nothing needed to be added, nothing needed to be said, because everything they needed to know had already been placed in front of them, clear, undeniable, and impossible to take back. No one reached for their glass again. No one returned to their conversation, because the room had lost its script, and no one knew how to write a new one. Daniel cleared his throat first, a small, uncertain sound that felt out of place in the heavy silence, and when he finally spoke, his voice lacked the easy confidence it had carried just minutes earlier. "Emily, you never mentioned." But he did not finish the sentence, because there was no version of that sentence that would not expose how little he had ever really asked. I turned my eyes toward him, slowly, not sharply, not with accusation, just enough to meet his gaze. And for the first time since we had met, he looked at me as if he were trying to understand who I actually was, instead of who he had assumed I had been. Across the table, Lauren shifted in her seat, her posture tightening, her earlier ease gone completely, replaced by a careful stillness, and when she spoke, her voice carried a thin edge of forced composure. "Major General?" she repeated, as if saying it aloud might somehow make it less real. "You're serious?" And I held her gaze for a moment, just long enough for the answer to settle without needing words, before I looked away again, because this was not a moment that required explanation, it required recognition. My father-in-law leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together, the authority he usually carried now redirected into something more cautious, more measured. "Emily," he said, choosing each word carefully, "we were not aware of your position." And there it was, the first attempt to reorganize the narrative, to shift from dismissal to diplomacy, to pretend that the past could be softened by a change in tone. I gave a small nod. not an agreement, not an acceptance, simply acknowledging that he had spoken, and then I let the silence return because I had learned that silence, when used correctly, forces people to confront their own words far more effectively than any argument ever could. The captain remained beside me, composed and still, in his presence, a quiet anchor that kept the moment from drifting back into something comfortable. And after a brief pause, he spoke again, this time addressing the room, his tone respectful but unmistakably firm. "Ma'am is expected at the base briefing in 45 minutes, he said, his words precise, leaving no room for interpretation. And that single sentence did something even more powerful than the first. It placed me back into a context they could not control, a world beyond this table where their opinions held no weight. Daniel straightened further, his confusion now mixed with something else, something closer to realization. "Base briefing?" he echoed, as if trying to piece together fragments of a life he had never fully seen, and I stood then, not abruptly, not dramatically, just a smooth, deliberate movement that signaled the end of my time at that table. My chair slid back quietly against the hardwood floor, the sound soft but definitive, and every pair of eyes followed me as I reached for my coat, the same coat they had seen me wear countless times, without ever questioning where it had come from or where it had taken me. Lauren's voice came again, softer now, stripped of its earlier sharpness. "Emily, wait." But I did not stop immediately. I let the moment stretch just long enough for her to understand that waiting had never been something I owed them. When I finally turned back, my expression remained calm, controlled, unchanged, because this was not about proving anything. It never had been. "You did not ask," I said simply, my voice even, not cold, not warm, just clear, and the truth of it settled heavier than any accusation could have. No one responded, not because they could not, but because there was nothing left that would not sound inadequate. And in that silence, in that absence of easy words and practiced roles, something finally shifted, not in me, but in them. I walked toward the doorway where the captain waited, my steps steady, measured, the same rhythm I had carried through years of rooms that demanded clarity and control. And as I reached the threshold, I paused just briefly, not to look back for approval, not to invite apology, but simply to acknowledge the space I was leaving behind, a space where I had once been diminished, overlooked, misunderstood, and now, finally, seen. I did not look back again after that, not because I was angry, not because I wanted to punish them, but because I understood something. They were only just beginning to realize that once the truth is seen, it does not need to be repeated. The night air outside was cooler than I expected, crisp against my skin, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and distant pavement still holding the day's warmth. And for a brief moment, everything felt quiet in a way that had nothing to do with silence, and everything to do with clarity. The captain opened the passenger door of the black vehicle waiting at the curb, his movements precise, respectful, and I stepped in without hesitation, the interior dim and familiar, the kind of controlled space where every detail served a purpose. As the door closed behind me, sealing off the house, the table, the voices that had defined me for so long, I exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but out of recognition, because this was not a moment of escape, it was a return. "Ma'am," the captain said once he had taken his seat, his tone steady as the engine started, "we have updated briefings regarding the joint operations timeline," and I nodded, shifting my focus immediately, because that was the part of my life that had always been real, always been clear, always been mine. The vehicle pulled away smoothly, tires rolling over the gravel with a low, controlled sound, and through the window, I caught a final glimpse of the house, its warm lights glowing against the dark, unchanged from the outside, as if nothing inside had shifted at all. But I knew better, because inside that house, at that table, something had cracked, something irreversible, something that would not be repaired with polite conversation or quiet denial. Daniel would sit there replaying every moment, every assumption, every time he had spoken for me instead of asking me, and he would realize, slowly and uncomfortably, that he had never truly known the person he married. Lauren would think about the $20 bill, about the laughter, about the way her words had sounded just minutes before everything changed, and she would understand that some moments do not fade. They settle, they stay, they redefine how you are seen. My mother-in-law would likely try to reorganize the story in her mind, to soften it, to frame it as a misunderstanding rather than what it was, but even she would not be able to ignore the tone in the captain's voice, the certainty in his words, the respect that had been given so naturally, so automatically, in a way that could not be faked or negotiated. And my father-in-law, a man who had built his life on reading people, on understanding power, would recognize the truth more clearly than the others, that everything he thought he understood about me had been based on absence, not reality. I did not need to be there to see it unfold. I did not need to hear their conversations or their attempts to piece together what they had missed, because their realization was not something I needed to witness to feel complete. The city lights passed by outside in steady patterns, reflections sliding across the window in quiet intervals, and I allowed myself a brief moment to sit with the contrast, the difference between the world I had just left and the one I was returning to, one built on assumption, the other on earned authority. Estimated arrival in 22 minutes, the captain added, glancing briefly at the dashboard before returning his attention forward, and I nodded again, my posture straight, my mind already shifting fully into the responsibilities ahead. There was no anger left in me, no lingering need to prove anything, because the moment at that table had already done what it needed to do. It had revealed the truth in a way that required no reinforcement. And as the vehicle moved through the night, steady and controlled, I understood something with a clarity that did not need to be spoken aloud. That respect given too late does not change the past, but it does redefine the future. And for the first time, I knew that whatever came next would not be shaped by their expectations, but by my own. Life did not become perfect after that night, but it became clear. And clarity has a quiet kind of peace that perfection never offers. The mornings that followed felt different. Not louder, not more dramatic, just steadier, like something inside me had finally settled into place after years of being slightly off balance. I returned to my work, to rooms where decisions carried weight and words were chosen carefully, but this time I carried something new with me. Not pride, not resentment, but a deeper understanding of what it means to belong to yourself completely. Daniel called 2 days later, his voice hesitant, stripped of certainty, asking questions he had never thought to ask before, and for the first time I answered honestly. Not to convince him, not to repair anything, but because I no longer needed to edit myself to be understood. We are still finding our way, slowly, carefully, with boundaries that did not exist before, boundaries that protect not just my time, but my identity. His family reached out too, in their own ways, some with awkward apologies, some with careful words that tried to bridge a gap they had only just realized was there, and I listened, but I did not rush to close that distance, because healing, real healing, is not about returning to what was, it is about deciding what is allowed moving forward. I still think about that moment sometimes, the sound of laughter, the weight of that $20 bill on the table, the way everything shifted in a single sentence, and I realize now that the moment did not define me, it revealed me. The truth is, people will often misunderstand you when your life does not fit into the categories they recognize. They will measure you using tools that were never designed to see you clearly, and if you let them, you can begin to believe those measurements yourself. But there is something stronger than their assumptions, something quieter but far more accurate, and that is your own sense of who you are, your own internal knowing, the voice that does not need validation to be true. I have learned that boundaries are not walls meant to shut people out. They are structures that hold your life together. They are the lines that remind others, and sometimes yourself, that your worth is not negotiable. Protect your time, protect your energy, protect your financial independence, because those are not just practical choices, they are acts of self-respect. Trust your instincts when something feels off, even if you cannot explain it yet, because that quiet voice is often the first signal that something needs your attention. And if you are listening to this right now, and you have ever sat at a table where you felt small, where your voice was overlooked, where your life was reduced to something it was never meant to be, I want you to know that you are not alone, and more importantly, you are not what they decided you were. You do not have to argue your value into existence. You do not have to perform for recognition. You only have to remain steady long enough for the truth to stand on its own. Sometimes God, or the universe, will place you in rooms where you are misunderstood, not to diminish you, but to reveal who you are when you choose not to shrink. And when that moment comes, when the truth finally meets the surface, it will not need to be loud. It will not need to be dramatic. It will simply be undeniable. Thank you for staying with me through this story, for listening, for allowing a part of my life to meet a part of yours. Because stories like this remind us that even in the quietest moments of doubt, there is something within us that remains unshaken. If this story stayed with you, if it felt familiar in any way, you can share your thoughts, your story, or simply where you are listening from. Because connection, even in small ways, matters more than we realize. My name is Emily Carter. I am 43 years old, and the lesson I want to leave you with is this: never let someone else's limited understanding define the size of your life.